Welcome to Dataless You. I'm Paul, coming to you from Brooklyn. Today we're going to take a look at Descartes' Discourse on Method. I will be reading from the Hackett version, the Donald Kress translation. I'm excited today. We're going to take a close look at the mind-body problem, as well as the modern dilemma of disembodiment. So, as we take a look here at a painting of the famous René Descartes, the French mathematician, philosopher, and overall genius, I want to give a brief introduction. I'm excited today because this is my first philosophy video. The plan today is to give you an overview of Cartesian dualism, and then at the end of the video to give you, well, essentially my critique of Cartesian dualism and the problems it has wrought over the centuries. But let's begin by taking a look at Descartes' life. He was born in 1596 in France, died in Sweden in 1650. You can peruse the details here at your leisure. But notice he did receive an excellent Jesuit education. After a reckless youth, he retreated for a life of tranquility. Something we're not going to talk a lot about today is his concern over Galileo's fate. During Descartes' lifetime, Galileo, of course, published his philosophy, essentially confirming the heliocentric view of the world, and of course was forced to recant by the Catholic Church and sort of suffer the consequences of sharing his thought with the public. Much of the sixth part of this book discusses Descartes' anxieties about publishing. It's fascinating reading. We won't be looking at it closely today, but I wanted to note it. It's also worth noting that, of course, every high school student is familiar with Descartes because of the Cartesian coordinate system or coordinate geometry, that little XY coordinate plane that we all struggled with in algebra and algebra 2 and pre-calculus is Descartes' invention, so we have him to thank for that. Descartes died of pneumonia after being brought to Sweden by the Queen, and his quote about living there, and he was only there about a year, is, "It seems to me that men's thoughts freeze here during the winter, just as does water." So, the full title for the book that we're investigating today is Discourse on the Method for Conducting One's Reason Well and for Seeking the Truth in the Sciences. This book is famous for the phrase, "I think, therefore I am." And we will, of course, be paying particular attention to that most famous sentence in just a bit. The book was published, as you see, in 1637 when Descartes was 41 years old. It's in 6 parts. We are going to pay attention to the first 4 parts. We're not going to really look at part 5 or 6. Also, we're only going to briefly look at part 3. So we're mostly concerned here with part 2, the chief rules of the method, and part 4, the arguments for God and the human soul, and particularly the argument for the human soul. I just want to briefly give you an anecdote about the first time I read Descartes. I was actually reading his meditations on first philosophy, which we will look at in the next video. And I was sitting under a tree in the courtyard of Mattey College at Princeton University. I was in Philosophy 101, more or less a grand survey course, one of my favorite classes that I took there. And I read Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, which is his extensive proof of the existence of God. And I was utterly mesmerized. I was transported. I sat under a tree and read the book in its entirety one sunny afternoon in the spring. And I rose from that reading totally convinced more or less, and absorbed in Descartes' way of thinking, and was in a kind of trance for at least the rest of the day, if not the rest of the week. Anyhow, I only tell the story to point out that Descartes has a rather arresting style, and I would recommend you pick it up and check it out for yourself. He's really something else. So let's get started. Part one of the book is sort of an introductory chapter. It includes Descartes' sort of general considerations about what he's about to do and about the sciences. But again, I would stress Descartes' tone is so wonderful. This is actually a fairly autobiographical book. It's written with a first-person perspective and a really humble tone. I mean, over and over, Descartes is saying, I may be wrong, and I'd love to be told so, but I think I've got it right. There's a very clear emphasis on deliberateness, and I just want to read this quote. Those who proceed only very slowly can make much greater progress, provided they always follow the right path, than do those who hurry and stray from it. As you see here, Descartes' main emphasis in the opening chapter is on reason, and he is known as a rationalist for that reason. Another anecdote, this one from Descartes' life before we dive into section 2. He's known for telling this story about November of 1619. He was still quite young. I guess that makes him about 24. He was sitting in a small stove-heated room, to give you an idea of the scene. And in short, he was despairing about the disunity and uncertainty of his knowledge. And as the introduction to the Hackett edition of Discourse on Method says, in a blinding flash he saw the method. So Descartes is one of these characters who experienced an epiphany, which many philosophers have yearned for. And to make matters even more dramatic, it's said that evening he had a series of dreams that seemed to put a divine stamp of approval on his project. So let's take a look at this divinely approved project. Part 2 of the book is, in fact, the method. In other words, the method of philosophy or of practicing the sciences or of pursuing truth that Descartes invented. In short, it's a method of radical doubt. Descartes wanted to tear down everything. Here's a guy who had an excellent education from the Jesuits, and he essentially left school thinking, I don't really buy any of that. So he puts emphasis on his own reason and his own thought. I'll read this quote. My plan has never gone beyond trying to reform my own thoughts and building upon a foundation which is completely my own. So this is an aspect of Descartes that I love. His radical doubt, his emphasis on one's own mind, one's own exploration. And in this video, you'll see that there are many, many things I love about Descartes and I find valuable and true even today. But of course, as I mentioned in the introduction, his sort of foundational dualism, which we're about to get to here, is something that I do have deep, deep problems with. So there's kind of a mix. I love Descartes, but I cannot abide his dualistic way of thinking. Before getting to the dualism, I just wanted to at least put up on the big board here a little bit about Part 3. Part 3 of Discourse on Method is a really lovely chapter. Reminds me of Benjamin Franklin writing about all of the ethics that he strove to live by in his autobiography. So you can sort of read these on your own, but in short, it's a really tender and brilliant description about how Descartes tried to live by the laws of his country and to be firm and resolute in his actions. In other words, pick a life and go with it. So it's interesting, whereas there's radical doubt in his philosophy, in his actions, in his behavior, and in his decisions. He wants to be firm and resolute. And then the third maxim here, to conquer myself rather than my fortune, is really wisdom itself. And it's a matter of knowing what we can do and striving to be that change, while also recognizing that which we have no power over, and abiding and being at peace with those aspects of our life or our lives. And then third, of course, as the famous AA dictum goes, and I want the wisdom to know the difference. So you can see a little bit of that here in part 3. Also notice Descartes' goal. He really was seeking tranquility. He valued tranquility very highly. He spoke about a sweet and innocent life. He also definitely valued solitary existence, and overall was seeking a kind of tranquil contentment. But let's get into the meat of this talk here, which is part 4, the big argument. I think, therefore I am. I've outlined the argument, or what Descartes calls the first principle of philosophy here, with 4 premises and then a conclusion. So let's go through this line by line. Premise 1. Reject our senses because, quote, our senses sometimes deceive us. I think that is fairly straightforward. If you want to follow along in the Hackett version, all of this is on page 18 and then continuing on to page 19. So let's look at premise 3. Reject the reasoning of other men because there are men who make mistakes in reasoning. Again, that seems like a fairly good idea. So I'm okay with premise 1. I'm okay with premise 2. Premise 3. Reject all waking thoughts as no more true than the illusions of my dreams. I'm okay with this premise as well. It's a basic Buddhist premise, incidentally, to regard all dharmas or all phenomena as dreams. I think it's a very good sort of dictum to live by, to sort of don't accept everything as so real, right? Our lives are more dreamlike than we sometimes believe. So premise 4 is where things get a little interesting. I'm going to quote, "While I wanted thus to think that everything was false, it necessarily had to be the case that I, who was thinking this, was something." His conclusion then, after these 4 premises, follows rather naturally. I think, therefore I am, or you can see it here in the Latin, cogito ergo sum, or in the French, as he published it. He published in French, so he could reach a popular audience, je pense, donc je suis. Or the sort of more strict translation that you come across in philosophy circles, I am thinking, therefore I am. Key to be very much in the present. I am thinking, therefore I am. So clearly it's premise 4 as well as the conclusion that I have a problem with. Just because thoughts occur to me, in my humble opinion, does not necessarily result in the existence of my soul, or my I, so to speak, that first person pronoun, myself. Descartes calls it the soul, and we'll look at that in a minute here, but I did want to pause and sort of note that I have really no problems with the first 3 premises. It's premise 4 and the conclusion where I start to have my doubts. And I would encourage you to look at this page here in the big board and come to your own conclusions. And of course, that's what Descartes would suggest you do. So the upshot here is a kind of mind-body dualism that has dominated Western philosophy for, how long is it now? 400 years? Quite a long time. Let me read this quote. Thus, this I, which comes just on page 19, just after the argument outlined in the last page. Thus, this I, that is to say, the soul through which I am what I am, is entirely distinct from the body, and is even easier to know than the body. And even if there were no body at all, it would not cease to be all that it is. A rather articulate thought. In other words, the soul exists entirely independent of the body. And as he says later, intelligent nature, or the nature of mind, is distinct from corporeal nature, or our physical selves. So this is a drawing of Descartes. This is his sort of trying to, in an image, show us how his dualism works. You notice there's sort of some sensations coming in the eye, and basically in the brain there somewhere, and it's actually in the pineal gland. Descartes argued that's where our thoughts are formed. So, in essence, mind-body dualism says that the mind and body are fundamentally different from one another. Look at the third bullet. Mind is distinct from matter, but can influence matter. And that's kind of the tricky point. How? And at this juncture, I am probably way in over my head. I'm only an amateur philosopher. But you could research modern neuroscience, modern philosophy. There are all sorts of theories, behavioral science, behavioral psychology, and particularly neuroscience and science of the mind is where there is a vigorous debate about how exactly mind influences matter, or how exactly the mind and body communicate. There's a vigorous debate going on. For Descartes, of course, the connection was the pineal gland. My view is that this gland is the principal seat of the soul and the place in which all our thoughts are formed. A famous quote, actually, from another work of Descartes. And there it is. There's the pineal gland. So Descartes thought he had it all figured out. He thought that in that little spot of our brains, thoughts are formed. And interestingly, for a guy who lived, 400 or 500 years ago, he wasn't too far off. I mean, it's definitely in the brain where the transaction, you might say, between mind and body is occurring. So I wanted to today explain the foundations of dualism in Western philosophy. And of course, this kind of thinking goes back even further to Plato, who is the first to propose that reason is paramount. In other words, mind is paramount, and the body or the passions are lower, was his word, than mind or reason, and therefore somewhat to be not disparaged so much as ruled by mind. Mind can control the body, and because of that supremacy, because of that ability of mind to rule the body, mind should be held in higher esteem. This kind of thinking, of course, is picked up by the Catholic or Christian Church. There's kind of a general disparaging of the body in the Church's teachings. And again, I'm way in over my head here, making hasty generalizations. But it's true that the teachings of the Church implore us to control the passions, to keep our soul pure and clean, to prepare it for reunion with God in the heavens. And so again, there's a great long history that Descartes here in the early 1600s is essentially drawing on, but also he's making a radical break with the church. In fact, his work was controversial. He was accused of being a libertine and an atheist, and spent much of the last years of his life sort of defending himself through various republications and letters and pamphlets and so forth. So this is the foundation of Western culture, this dualistic view. Mind is immaterial and is higher. body is material and is lower, and that they're essentially different. To me, as we look here at the modern problem of disembodiment, big board, to me this is a problem. In modern culture, we live up in our heads nearly all the time. We tend to disparage the body and praise the mind. And this essential disembodiment leads to a lack of balance, energetically speaking. And I know that the language is getting a little new age there, and that's okay with me. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool mystic, as we'll look at in future talks. So I wanted to talk about what I see as the solution, which I've recapitulated here in 4 steps. I would argue for the total eradication of Cartesian dualistic ways of thinking. I think we need to recognize the body as the seat of the soul, and recognize mind and matter as one and the same, which of course is a kind of formula that I will need to unpack in great detail later in future videos. I think we need to increase our respect for the body as equally important as mind and reason, and cultivate an energetic balance between the mind and the body through exercise, yoga, and most importantly, the practice of meditation. And by meditation, I don't mean disembodied, heady sorts of meditations. I mean meditations that engage with the body. And again, we can look at all of this in future videos. Today, I just wanted to give you a sense of Descartes. Here's the young Descartes, probably college age here, when he was a young man studying the Jesuit Aristotelian system that he would go on to reject. Hopefully, this gives you a sense of Descartes' thinking. Stay tuned for another video on his proof of God from his book Meditations on First Philosophy. And hopefully you can take some of my thoughts presented here at the end of the video and decide for yourselves sort of where you stand on this issue of the mind-body problem, and if you recognize any sort of systemic disembodiment in our culture, and if so, if there's anything we can do about it. In the meantime, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the future.